Hi. Notice how they didn't start by saying one of my favorite PhD students here. So I'm slightly offended. All right, I'm Michelle. I'm a third-year PhD student here at the Landscapes of Change Lab. And today I'm going to talk to you about novel fire disease, how they may buffer forest from disease impacts. So first, I'm going to start off with what I think is the coolest thing and tree species in the world, sugar pine. It's actually referred to as the king of pines, and it's the largest pine species in the world. Some of the best specimens are observed in Yosemite National Park. But unfortunately, they're experiencing extremely high mortality rates in the Southern Sierra. Some research out of Sequoia Kings National Park suggests that some populations saw as high as 50% mortality, which leads to concerns about the longevity of this species. So clearly these giants are under threat, and some of those threats include drought, insects, fire, and disease. But today I'm going to focus on fire and disease, and specifically how there may be emergent interactions between them. So fire behavior is changing. Like my lab mate Olivia was demonstrating earlier, fire frequency is increasing along with severity and extent. And this is largely in part due to fire suppression. In the early 1900s, we had a 10 a.m. policy where fires that were observed had to be put out by 10 a.m. the next day. And this led to an accumulation of biofuels that have coupled with climate change to lead to double fire behavior. But fire isn't the only thing playing out on these landscapes. We also have disease, specifically an invasive disease called white pine blister rust. Now, I mentioned invasive, which means that these trees have little to resistance to this disease, which makes it so risky because if you become infected as a tree, now it's accidentally introduced in the early 1900s to North America, and by the late 1960s, it arrives in the Sierra Nevada. It does really well in the Sierra Nevada, in part because its alternate host is really present there, the Sierra gooseberry. And how the transmission cycle works is it generally starts with the Sierra gooseberry becoming infected with fungal bodies that then transfer to the primary pine host that will transfer back to the alternate host, which continues this cycle of spread. Some of these symptoms and what we look for when we're in the field are things like flagging, bull cankers, which ultimately lead to streaming pitch and crown dieback, and eventually death. This is an extremely slow process. It can take decades to succeed. But it's important to note that these disturbances are natural. What's different is how they're behaving. So changes in their behavior are leading to decreases in sugar pine density, which raise concerns about the longevity of the species. So I wanted to know if changes in these disturbances were leading to new opportunities for them to interact. And so I specifically wanted to answer two questions. The first is, how does fire change white pine blister rust prevalence? And the second is, if there's a relationship between these two disturbances, what are the mechanisms that fuel this relationship? So few studies, when we look in the literature, have actually tested this relationship. And the studies that have found no significant relationship. But some studies suggest that fire could actually increase white pine blister rust prevalence because its alternate host is actually what's considered a fire follower. It establishes really well after fire. But when we look in other pathosystems, we actually find that some fire interactions are emerging, specifically in sudden oak death pathosystems in California oak woodlands, where we're finding that fire is reducing sod through two mechanisms. The first, that fire decreases density, which reduces the probability of infection and spread. The second is that fire changes microclimate conditions, which make the site less suitable for transmission. So I wanted to see if this relationship was emerging in sugar pine populations in Yosemite National Park. So we hypothesized that fire can mitigate disease impacts through three mechanisms. The first is that fire would remove active infections from the landscape. Second is that fire would reduce pine host density and recruitment. And third is that fire would change microclimate conditions. This, we had to first have sugar pine, and then we had to have a fire. And we specifically looked at the rim fire, because it burned approximately 250,000 acres of the sugar pine range. And at the time, it was the third largest wildfire in California history. To date, it is still the largest wildfire to happen within Yosemite National Park. But as of 2026, the rim fire doesn't even make the top 10 as far as California wildfires go. Now, this makes the rim fire a perfect case study for testing if there's an emergent fire disease interaction. So we looked at 56 plots across a fire severity gradient in Yosemite and National Park. And what we did at each of these plots is first, we needed to have pilot landscape, and we calculated pilot density. Second, we would catalog infections, so look for actual symptoms of the disease like flagging, dead tops, streaming pitch, and sometimes the actual fungal bodies. And third, we would look for alternate host presence on the landscape due to its significance in the transmission cycle. So now I could set out to test this question if fire changes white pine blister rust prevalence. But in order to do this well, I first need to isolate the influence of fire on white pine blister rust. So I need to control for my confounders. Some of my confounders in this system would be one, land surface temperature, because climate is an important variable that changes the outcome of fire presence and disease presence. Then we have topography variables such as elevation, aspect, and slope. And finally, we have pre-fire tree density metrics, which I used canopy cover data from land fire. So when I put all this in a linear model, I find that there's a relationship between fire and disease. And what is this relationship visually? It looks like this. We see that as fire severity increases, we have a decrease in disease prevalence. But now we want to see what's actually driving this relationship between fire and disease. And so we're going to test out some pathways. First, we hypothesized that fire would change pilot recruitment, which would therefore impact the outcome of white pine blister rust. The same goes for adult pilot density. We also think that climate is going to change after fire is present on the landscape, and alternate host presence is going to change. So now to visually show you what each of these pathways look like with all of our data, first I'll talk about regeneration. We see that we have a variable amount of regeneration across our fire severity gradient, but at our highest fire severity class, we have the lowest regeneration happening. Second, for our adult tree density, we see a similar trend where we have our lowest adults at our highest fire severity class. And then when we look at climate, this is kind of where our story gets more interesting. We have a couple things happening, so I'm going to break this up for you. First, when we look at our pre-fire conditions, which is 10 years pre-fire from 2003 to 2012, we see that all of our sites are within this 22 to 32 degree range. And there's some variability, but it's nothing crazy. When you add in post-fire conditions, which is 2014 to 2023, we see that not only do we exceed this 10 degree range, but we see an increase at all of our plots in climate. So this aligns with climate change. Obviously, the climate is changing and we're seeing an increase in temperatures at these sites. The other thing that we're seeing is that temperatures increase across a fire severity gradient. So as you get higher fire severity, you're getting higher temperatures. And the last thing that we see is we see the most drastic difference between our pre and post-fire conditions at our highest fire severity class, meaning that fire is directly impacting climate at these sites. And finally, our less interesting finding is that rabies presence increases as fire severity increases, which is stated in the literature that because these are fire followers, they would establish really well post-fire. So this means that this isn't our mechanism that suppresses disease. So that's out. But what we do have is regeneration, tree density, and temperature changes. So first, I want to talk about the significance of each of these mechanisms. And when we look at regeneration, what's happening is that sugar pine recruitment is decreasing. This means that less pine host individuals are being added to these landscapes. This is important because our recruitment class size saw the highest infection rates. So we're removing a really important mechanism here for disease spread. Second, our adult pilot density is decreasing. This means that less adult pine hosts are available for white pine blister rust transmission. This is important because adult trees are infected for really long periods of time. And so this is also disrupting an important pathway for disease spread. And finally, land surface temperature is increasing. This means that the climate is less suitable for transmission at these sites. And this is important because spores are generally limited to around 30 degrees Celsius. So once we exceed this threshold, we're no longer going to have sites that are suitable for white pine blisterus to establish. So in summary, are changes in the disturbances creating new opportunities for them to interact? Yes, we do see an interaction emerging. And how is fire changing white pine blisterus? It's actually suppressing it. And what are the mechanisms that are driving this relationship? Well, we have three. And what does this mean for the future of sugar pine? It's kind of bleak, unfortunately. High severity fire is reducing white pine blisterus, but it's also removing this iconic species from the landscape. So these findings underscore the urgent need for science-backed management to curb the decline of the king of pines. And for the first time in my career, I've actually been fortunate enough to do this, where this science is directly informing Yosemite and Sequoia National Park. And we identified 75 individuals that we are climbing over a 3-year span to collect cones from. And the first round of individuals have actually gone through what's known as inoculation trials, which 9 out of 20 of them are actually being deemed resistant. And typically only 3% of the population is resistant. So if you do that math, it's actually pretty high. So I'm super stoked about the future of this research and happy to talk more if you're interested in cone collections or anything. But other than that, I'd like to thank all the people who made this possible and the funds as well. Happy to answer any questions.
Wow. Our all-time favorite PhD student. Do we have any questions for Michelle from the audience? Kinds.
You kind of got at my question, which is, would you say you wouldn't recommend, say, like controlled or prescribed burns to try to help support these pine species because the decrease in density is decreasing the disease, but also pines, right?
Yeah. So that's actually a really good question, and I didn't answer it well, partly because it's another project that we're doing, where we're looking at multiple disturbance impacts, right? We're looking at droughts, beetles, fire, and disease. Something about prescribed burns is typically they're done at a low severity, right? And they're very controlled. And at our lowest fire severity, yeah, we're seeing a decrease in recruitment and adult pila, but that's okay. You expect some mortality, but you also expect by managing fuels, you'll see post-fire 10 years from now, a healthy establishment of sugar pine in the future. The problem is these other disturbances like bark beetles really like low severity fires. They typically target trees that are stressed. And so trees that are burned at low severity send out a pheromone that bark beetles will come and attack. And so that's another avenue for mortality. So the thing that we recommend right now is really doing these like resistance trials combined with low severity fire at a very well managed scale. That's hard to do in these sites.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.